Dr. Greg Mahr and I should say Doctors Greg Mahr and Chris Drake. Welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah. So we're going to be discussing your work and your book, The Wisdom of Dreams, Science, Synchronicity, and Language of the Soul. And I have to say, there's so many books out there on dreams, and it's remarkable to find one that and notice it fuzzes out when I try to show it. But at any rate, take my word for it, folks. It's a rather slim volume considering all the material that you guys have packed in. And but before we get into the book, I'd like to learn a bit about each of you. And so, Greg, you're an MD and a psychiatrist. Did you plan to be a psychiatrist when you were a kid?
I kind of had a lifelong interest in dreams and psychiatry or psychology. I was reading Freud and Jung in high school and recording my own dreams and things like that.
Good for you. Yeah, wow.
I actually have at least 3,000 dreams I've recorded since I was 10, so it's been a long-standing interest of mine.
Wow. Well, you can engage in some archaeological explorations of yourself, going back. And do you ever go back and look at any of those dreams to see?
I have, and I've discussed them in a dream group I help run, and I have thought about them. So it's kind of interesting to think about how, and I've seen this with other individuals I work with, how dreams change over time.
Yeah.
As the person develops and changes.
Yeah, I don't know if everybody in the audience knows that I'm particularly drawn to this topic and to your approach to it. I also have been a leader of dream groups and member of dream groups and kept dream journals over the years. So we're on the same page, guys, and I always enjoy that. What did you major in as an undergrad then?
I decided I wanted to go to med school, so I majored in biology. I kind of double majored in biology and philosophy because I really liked philosophy too. So I did that double majored and then went to med school.
Okay. And why did you want to become an MD? Where did that desire come from?
Oh, probably on some level, I was probably identifying with Freud and Jung, who were MDs.
Yeah.
It seemed more like employable or something. At least in those days, it seemed easier.
Yeah, that's true. And yeah, in those days, I don't know when those days were for you, but I know for me, I worked in placements. I had placements where the person running the supervision and all was an MD, even though I may have had more experience having started with psychology and psychotherapy early on. So that was a bit of a pill to swallow, and also insurance reimbursement was better. But all of that picture has changed and become perhaps even cloudier. And you're also a writer and a poet, I understand.
Yes, I've kind of had a midlife crisis about 12 or 15 years ago when I had a heart attack, and I decided to sort of do what I've always wanted to do instead of trying to fit in. Actually, the first thing I did after my heart attack when I got home was to buy Jung's Red Book, and then I started
a hefty volume.
Joined the dream group and started getting interested, in expressing my interest in those things directly. Included in that what was writing. So I started. I was in a couple writing groups, and I written a fair amount of poetry and flash fiction. I just published a little collection of poetry, actually. But I've published flash fiction and poetry in a number of medical and non-medical journals. So that's kind of been part of the journey. It's kind of another way of getting inside your head, in my mind, at least.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. My experience has been I don't know what I'm thinking until I write it down, and
That's
that's a
exactly.
it's a process of discovery. um, so, Chris, let's focus on you. You're a PhD psychologist. How did a nice guy like you get involved in psychology?
Ended up in a place like this, right? Yeah, no, I had a fascination with lucid dreams. I had a couple lucid dreams in high school and sort of didn't realize what they were. It sort of led me to read Stephen LaBerge's stuff, some other books on lucid dreaming that I was just super fascinated with, and sort of became a hobby of mine. And obviously read Freud's interpretation of dreams and envisioned myself becoming a dream researcher someday. I ended up going a slightly different path in that I'm a sleep researcher, and that was sort of something that grew out of the fact that I got sort of talked out of being a dream researcher by the fact that a lot of times dream research is not well funded, so it's not always a path to a career, maybe more like a hobby for me. But it was certainly very interesting, and I don't know if midlife crises are contagious, but I started getting back into dreams and back into lucid dreams, probably over the last 5 or 6 years, and began doing a little bit of research on dreaming, which has sort of grown after talking with Greg and writing this book, and some other things that have happened have sort of led me back to dreams serendipitously.
And what flavor psychologist are you? Clinical, experimental, what?
I'm a clinical psychologist,
Okay.
but I really focus on research pretty much 100% of my time now. But the focus of my research is clinical psychology, and specifically in treating insomnia. So I do lots of behaviorally based clinical trials. I do NIH studies, but I also work in the pharmaceutical industry doing clinical trials. And so I have a very varied sort of background at this point in time, which keeps me from being too bored.
Yeah, I guess so. I've been interested off and on in lucid dreaming, but have not been able to develop any real skill at it. I find that the times when I've had spontaneous lucid dreams, I get so excited that it wakes me up. Oh, I'm having a lucid dream, and then I wake up.
That's one of the tricks. I'm learning how to sort of maintain your composure to the extent that you don't get woken up out of your dream. It's a very important part of the process.
Yeah, right. I need to keep plugging away at it, I guess. So, how did the two of you get together and decide to collaborate on a book?
Well, I was invited I'm invited as part of my job. I'm invited to talk at various departments about psychiatric aspects of medical care. So the sleep medicine program invited me to talk about psychiatric issues. Actually, the specific topic they wanted me to talk about was screening for depression in insomnia patients. But that, like 10 years ago, like before my heart attack, I'd have probably just gone ahead and done it. But I sort of didn't, that sounded really boring to me. So I called up the person who invited me and I said, well, I would do that, but that topic sounds like kind of a snoozer. How about if I talk about dreams instead? And to my surprise, she said yes. So I gave this lecture, and I had known Chris in the past off and on, but we had kind of lost touch. But we touch base again at that lecture, kind of synchronously. So I can pass that on to Chris now.
Yeah, it sort of was a case of synchronicity in a way, because I normally don't go to those lectures unless I'm giving them. But in this case, I sort of dropped by in the middle, and lo and behold, Greg was talking about dreams and was asking, members of the audience to volunteer, one of their dreams for interpretation or exploration, if you will. And so I sort of volunteered one of my early lucid dreams. I sort of come to call it a big dream, and sort of talked about it. And afterwards, we sort of, I guess, reconnected in a way, got together talking a little bit about some of the, lucid dreaming research that I was getting into again, and sort of thinking about, and Greg sort of discussed a little bit about a thought that he had about writing a book on dreams, and it sort of grew out of that.
All right. And now there are tons of books out there on dreaming. I think I already alluded to that. And so what would you say makes your book unique? You must have some pride about that to carry you through the project.
For sure.
No, it was a hard but enjoyable, satisfying journey. But I think one of the things that makes it unique is our teamwork, because I think a book just about sleep science or a book just about dream interpretation would be, that's kind of been done, but to attempt to kind of synthesize the two and write in one voice, I think was something unique that we offered, because we learned a lot from each other in the process, so I think that's one unique thing.
Yeah, I mean, Greg's patient-centered focus and my research focus was sort of unique. If you want to look at dream books that are out there, I think we've tried to sort of synthesize those two viewpoints, and to the extent that maybe we were successful at that, I think that is a unique contribution. And trying to do that, as Greg mentioned, was sometimes a really challenging, difficult task. But we were really trying to model the synthesis that we want to be present in, in our society as a whole. Sort of really investigating yourself, thinking about yourself in sort of ways that may be important clinically, and being able to sort of think about dreams and utilize them in therapy and in your personal life.
Yes, I think we were both kind of concerned that the culture, the scientific and clinical culture, had moved away from dreams, and therapists weren't interested in dreams, sleep researchers weren't interested in dreams. So we wanted to sort of change that, and bring dreams back into the dialogue, as it were.
Yeah, I don't remember if I read the title of your book out, but I think I'd like to do that again, even if I did do it before. The book is titled The Wisdom of Dreams: Science, Synchronicity, and the Language of the Soul. And indeed, the book lives up to the promise of, it delivers what's in that subtitle. And so I value that. Well, let's move on. Let's see, what else did I want to add? Talk about the structure of the book. The book has its own interesting structure, including the fact that at the beginning of every chapter starts with a discussion of a dream.
Yes, that structure was important in its own right. There's a couple reasons behind that. One, we wanted to give people and therapists the experience of working with dreams, because they're kind of like phobic about dreams. So we wanted to make dreams acceptable. So we wanted to start every chapter with a dream and talk about that dream and kind of explore it in more depth at the end. And what we found in writing it, that the dream, once we found a good dream to cover on a topic, the dream almost kind of wrote the chapter for us, because it almost kind of, this chapter would kind of grow out of the discussion, amplification of the dream, as it were.
Yeah. Yes. Right. Yeah. I find that a lot of therapists are phobic about touching dreams. They feel like, oh, they don't have the special training that they would need. They leave that to analysts, I guess, and they will sort of beg off of that.
Well,
And
a quick comment about that.
yeah,
My wife is an analyst, just recently trained, 5 or so years back, and during her training, dreams were not really a focus at all, and
wow,
the Freudian sort of the Freudian groups have sort of moved away from making dreams a focus, at least in that training program anyway. And in fact, at worst, it's probably a bit of a taboo now sometimes to sort of think about dreams in therapy, and in a variety of ways. That's disappointing to me, obviously.
sure,
But it's really a unique sort of opportunity for us to try to bring it back in a different way, maybe from a more exploration kind of approach, as opposed to interpretation in the Freudian sense. I think probably we're a little closer to the Jungian sort of aspects of how we sort of view dreams and explore.
yeah. And that's one of the things I like so much about the book, is the degree that the Freudian influence is in there, even as you also talk about the science aspects and so on. Yeah, but I subscribe to, as I'm sure you do, that Freud referred to dreams as the royal road to the unconscious, and I really find that to be true. At least that's my impression.
Yeah.
What do you guys think about the unconscious? What's your position on the unconscious? A lot of therapists don't believe in an unconscious. They think that's there's no way to really operationalize the idea of the unconscious. And where do you guys come out with that?
Well, I think there's an underlying bias within psychology, and the term we used in the book is scientism, that
Yeah,
only that which is objectively verifiable is real, and the rest is kind of nonsense. And that leads to people like that leads to these important historical figures like Freud and Jung being just left out of the discussion. Like my son got a psychology degree from a very good school in Michigan, and he learned nothing about Freud. Freud was discussed kind of as a historical anachronism, and
right.
finally, like his last year, he was taking a class on psychotherapy. So I thought, finally, they're going to have to learn about Freud. But then I saw his textbook was titled Evidence-Based Therapy. So I thought, oh, they're not going to have to talk about Freud again.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
that was. Go ahead.
I come from a school, sort of the tail end of the school of behaviorism. So when I was being trained, a lot of the stuff we did in graduate school was obviously focused only on behaviorally based interventions, and harkens back to now. This I wasn't in training then, I wasn't alive then, but if you think about the 50s and the sort of advent of behaviorism, that was, I think, one of the big reasons why the unconscious mind was neglected for a while, and the probably one of the reasons why dreams weren't taken very seriously, because that you had to have, as you say, sort of an objective, verifiable sort of documentation of the unconscious in some way to sort of really legitimately study it or address it. And then came the 60s, and you had sort of the new age sort of era taking over a little bit more. But by the time the 70s and 80s rolled around, there were sort of pioneers in lucid dreaming like Stephen LaBerge and Kern and others who sort of understood that there was this other very interesting phenomenon that they rediscovered from ancient times, really, of lucid dreaming. And now more recently, it's become legitimized because there's a number of studies which show and prove that, you can be awake and aware. That's lucid dreaming, right? Dreaming, right, but still being awake and aware in your dream enough to actually signal to the outside world, and you can measure that in the sleep laboratory with an EEG, looking at how the eyes move, and a priori sort of determining what kind of signals you want your subject to convey to the experimenter, and prove, in fact, that you're having a lucid dream, that you're awake and aware in your dream while REM sleep is going on. Neurophysiologically, you're also awake, and so that sort of awakened a lot of research. And now I think there's become a renaissance, I think, in dream research at the present time, where it's much more legitimate to think about the unconscious, but to think about also, dreams in a sort of more open way in terms of science.
Yeah. I had an experience similar to your son's, I think, that I remember being in a intro to psych class at the University of Pennsylvania, and the lecturer down there, it was one of these tiered down lecture setups, right? This eminent psychologist who's teaching the class, probably, I think they forced some of the full professors, they had to pay their dues by taking on an intro class. But at any rate, I remember him very clearly saying, if you're here because you're interested in finding out about the quirks of your own personality or those of your friends, you're in the wrong place. Psychology is the science of the study of behavior. So, you're in the wrong place. And he was right. I was in the wrong place, because that was exactly why I thought, hey, psychology sounds like it could be, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do after I decided to drop out of engineering, and I thought, well, psychology could be the place to be. And you're talking about the Renaissance, and part of that Renaissance is an awakening and awareness of the importance of dreams in other cultures, and non-Freudian cultures, and way before Freud. And you guys touch on that, and so maybe you could comment on that. What is it that we learn from? Well, I'm thinking of I think it's the Tibetans who were developed a real science of lucid dreaming, right?
That's right. I mean, many books in Tibetan culture. One of the more famous ones, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, is really focused on sort of being awake and aware in your dreams in order to potentially have a good death.
Yeah.
And there's other sort of practices. A variety of Tibetan monks and sects that really sort of require you to study and to facilitate your own practice of lucid dreaming before you can sort of graduate from that. And that's very important, I think, still in that culture. It's really our own culture that's probably one of the only cultures that doesn't value dreams, at least from the scientific point of view, quite as much. Greg's really the expert on that area.
Yeah, part of the reason we talked about other cultures is to we tend to see our culture as the pinnacle of human,
right? Yeah.
And if we think about we think, isn't it strange that these other cultures and our own past value dreams so much, where we should be thinking the other way around is, why don't we, when through all of history and in many other parts of the world, dreams are very important. I remember talking to one of my Islamic friends, and he was telling me how when he was a kid, the common conversation topic over breakfast was, what did you dream last night? I mean, that would be unusual in our culture.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you go back eons, I mean, and some people have sort of suggested that, these cave paintings, some of which depict individuals with, duck heads, humans with duck heads and so forth, and a variety of different things, 50,000 years ago, may have been inspired by dreams. And so if you think about the research on dreams and creativity, that potentially fits very well. And so if you sort of think about all of these cultures dating back thousands and thousands of years, value dreams so much, and even today, almost all cultures value dreams so much. Why are we giving them up?
Yeah, really. And you talk about a renaissance that's going on right now, and part of that renaissance is happening in the neural science and study of the brain. And how do you see that that's informed our understanding of dreams? Part of the argument had been that, well, we can't get inside the black box of a person's head, so we can't talk about consciousness. But now we get in the black box of the person's head in a certain way.
Well, that is also one illustration of the importance of dreaming, is that in animal species, only the more advanced species dream, which suggests how important that must be from an evolutionary point of perspective, because you are paralyzed in REM sleep. So
right.
It's a big investment from an organism's point of view to be lying there not being able to move, so it must be important. So why are we neglecting it? But Chris knows a lot more about the biology of it.
Well, one thing to say is we do know quite a bit about the state of REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep, which is a bit of a misnomer, because many animals, if we think about that as the dream state, many animals, for example, owls don't move their eyes but still dream. And moles.
No, wait a second. What? How do we know that owls dream?
That's
if
a
they
great
don't
question.
Move their eyes.
That's a great question. We know, that they have REM sleep, because you can disassociate that state from simply the rapid eye movements that occur. So there's a variety of things, as Greg mentioned, reduction in muscle tone, an elevation in the awakening threshold that occurs, and a variety of other things that sort of hint us at this state is what we call rapid eye movement sleep, even if the rapid eye movements are present, or even in animals where there are no eyes. And so what also can happen is, I'll give you an example of a dog, for example. How do we know animals dream? And one of the things that we know is there's a disorder, for example, called REM behavior disorder, where we lose that muscle atonia, which is basically a paralysis of the muscles that occurs normally when we dream, so that we don't act out our dreams and become prey for the predators that are out there. And in this disorder, you lose that capacity. So patients may be sleeping in bed and wake up, not wake up, but actually have a dream and basically wake up their partner by flailing around. In fact, there's reports of patients getting up out of bed who used to be football players and would sort of get up out of bed during a dream and sort of get into a football stance and tackle the dresser and end up in the sleep clinic with injuries from that kind of a disorder. And so you can actually experimentally induce this in animals and show that when you take away that muscle atonia, animals will oftentimes do a variety of different things. Stalking, aggression, fear, grooming, running, those kinds of things can occur when you do that. So, the assumption there is that the animals are dreaming when you see that type of behavior. And you can look at a variety of different things like that in the animal kingdom, but all the way down to, mostly birds and mammals are the ones that we sort of have the most strongest idea from a scientific perspective that they do dream. But there every year are sort of increasing sort of folks on that list, spiders.
We're drilling further and further down, huh?
Further and further down. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that REM sleep is really not a unitary state. If you go back in evolution, there were sort of parts of it that evolved and sort of eventually evolved to where it is today. So you can have dissociated properties of the REM state in different creatures. So, for example, platypus and octopus and other creatures we think now dream for a variety of reasons, but their REM sleep doesn't necessarily look like human REM sleep.
This is beginning to get into consciousness. It sounds like to a similar question is at what point can a creature be considered to have some form of consciousness?
That's right. There's even theories from Hobson, who just passed on recently, but was a major dream researcher at Harvard, that talked about the REM state as being potentially a proto-consciousness state, in that maybe had been one of the first states that we had before becoming conscious creatures.
It's interesting to kind of imagine, Chris mentioned cave paintings. It's interesting to kind of imagine our sleep cycle eons ago, because with our electric lights, we kind of create a state of endless summer, and we try to press our sleep into a small time window, whereas, 50,000 years ago, when you were in the winter, it would be dark for 16, 18 hours, and you'd be in a cave, you wouldn't sleep that long, so you'd be up. The sleep cycle becomes biphasic. Then people would sleep and then be up for a few hours in the middle of the night and then go back to sleep.
Give us sort of an opportunity to contemplate our dreams, to contemplate the night, and
to be in that quasi-altered state.
Yeah, Ruben Naiman often talks about the fact that, but certainly we're a sleep-deprived nation, for example. We're 24/7 working all the time, and everyone recognizes the dangers of that. But Ruben Naiman often talks about us being REM deprived, and I think we really are. As Greg mentioned, we have this consolidated sleep. We get up, we eat breakfast, we get on the road, and we're at our work. There's really no room for contemplating what might have happened in the unconscious or the conscious, dreaming periods that we had during sleep. And if you let it go for even just a few minutes and don't, consolidate that memory by maybe recording your dreams or other ways to do it, you're going to lose it. You're not going to remember your dreams.
That's right.
And eventually we feel like that's really a loss for us as a society when that happens.
Yeah. Now, another revolution that's going on at the same time as all of this is the what I would call the psychedelic renaissance, of a rediscovery of the usefulness, the potential usefulness, both in therapy and in personal development and experience and so on. And I think you touch on that in the book. Give us your thoughts about that.
Yeah, there is a chapter about that in the book, and that is a very interesting area. And some of the same kinds of phenomena, the way the brain, the way the mind allows other stimuli in and opens associations to things that are normally not associated and allows for that. That is similar both in REM sleep and with psychedelics. And it's interesting that psychedelics are of great interest now, but we seem to kind of forget that we trip every night and it's free and there's not against the law. Ignore that.
Yeah.
Look for artificial trips when we have our own.
Certainly there's some differences between LSD, in the dream state. Visuals are a little bit different, maybe more geometric. While on LSD, shapes are sort of more common. Synesthesia, for example. But the other things are probably much more similar. There's probably much more similarities between those states. We think about Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception opening, but that's really maps onto the neurophysiology of dreaming. So, for example, when we are in REM sleep, one of the more important things that happens is the inhibitory function of the cortex goes away. So, lots of stuff's going on, and that this makes it much more bizarre. And certainly the subcortical, affective, emotional areas of our brains become disinhibited, and so we have these bizarre things happening that remind us of the hallucinogenic states that go along with the those properties. But it's a really interesting time for creativity too, right? So you have different areas of the brain, maybe far-reaching areas of the brain that aren't typically activated together, become activated, and that then can lead to some very interesting creative events that occur during the REM period.
Yeah, a good quote is from Stephen King's. Someone was congratulating him on how productive he is and how well he writes horror books, and he kind of laughed and said, "Well, it's not me; it's the boys in the basement." And he was
right.
referring to that
Yeah.
it's not the conscious ego that writes, that is creative as much as the conscious ego allowing itself to experience things from other parts of the brain. And you see that both with psychedelics and especially with dreams. So many famous artworks like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Paul McCartney's Yesterday came to him in a dream. The same with Mary Shelley. She was she was only 17 or 18, and she was on a trip with her future husband, Percy Shelley, and Byron. A bunch of well-known poets were there.
Yeah.
And they decided as a game, because it was raining, to write a horror story for the next day. And Mary Shelley was very intimidated and anxious and wasn't sure what to do. But when she fell asleep that night, she had the dream that became Frankenstein. So
there's also a lot of really interesting, scientific, creative aspects that we could talk about briefly. For example, Mendeleev, who's working on trying to develop the periodic table over many, many years, woke up from a dream with all of the elements of the periodic table in place. He just had to sort of carry that onto paper. And Kekulé is another great example, who was the scientist who had sort of been working on developing molecules, and found sort of that one of his dreams precipitated the understanding of the benzene ring. And maybe I'll let Greg talk about that a little bit, but it sort of brings in the symbolism that we're used to thinking about with Jung and his sort of approach to dreams as well.
Yeah, it was interesting. He knew the chemical structure of organic molecules, but he didn't know how they were arranged, and he struggled with that. And they're arranged in these carbon rings. But he didn't have a dream of a carbon ring. He had a dream of an Ouroboros, this ancient archetypal symbol of a snake eating its own tail. But he recognized, oh, that's the answer. So it's interesting how the dreaming mind speaks in this archaic language. It's very reminiscent of Jung, and it probably also, I mean, there's no way of knowing this, but in my mind, I speculate that it picks those kind of symbols because it speaks a language of images, but also because it wants to say more than just the answer. Like I think it was also telling Kekulé, yeah, this is how carbon molecules are arranged, but remember that structure gives it the eternity and regeneration of life, and so that's why it's picked that image for that deeper meaning. And I think dreams kind of do that because they connect us with that archaic spiritual. I don't mean archaic in a negative sense, in that deeper world.
Right. Yeah, and this puts me in mind of visual thinkers versus non-visual thinkers. Some people think by and large visually. My wife is one of those. And also a very creative person. Um, and I think in words. I'm just totally locked into language and words. But certainly I do dream, and there are times when I am aware that I think maybe as I get older, my it's all gotten a lot more permeable, so that the boundaries, associations come so easily and unbidden to me now.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Um, let's see, what else do we want to touch on here?
I think that speaks to your allowing those associations in, because I think for a lot of people, they become more and more closed. So I think that speaks well of your openness to the inner world.
Yeah, well, willy-nilly, whether I don't know what to attribute it to exactly, but it's definitely something that I'm aware of happening with me. I wonder, are you guys, I would think you must have been involved or aware of IASD, the International Association for the Study of Dreams? You guys members?
Yes, I'm a member. I spoke at their last conference. I'm speaking at their next conference. Yes, it's a wonderful meeting, a fun group.
Right. And one of the reasons that comes to mind is they asked me to do an interview of somebody who was going to be one of the keynote speakers, I think, to find somebody to help advertise and promote the upcoming meetings. And so I'm wondering if they will accept this interview. I'm hoping maybe they will, since I've gone ahead and done it.
No, I enjoyed the last meeting a lot. They had a interesting activity. One of the final nights, they had a dream ball where you dressed up as a character from your own dreams. It was very unusual, enjoyable event.
Yeah. They're a remarkable organization because they are very open-handed to both scientists and lay people. And so essentially anybody can join, and everybody's treated with pretty much equal respect in terms, there's a real openness there. I've been off and on a member, and I think went to maybe the very first one, or so
yeah, they're very respectful of art and creativity as well. There was a nice art show during the
Yes, yeah, that's always very interesting as well. And I was influenced by a session I went to years ago talking about using dreams as a stimulus for writing. And certainly in my classes and teaching, I've used haiku. Not that I invented that idea, but it's one I picked up, and that I've just found a really useful way to get into a dream is to have people write haiku, where they have to express their something about the dream in, say, 3 lines of poetry. And that can be very, very revealing. And
yeah, that kind of compression of language imagery that you see in poetry is very reminiscent to the kind of condensation that Freud talked about in dreams.
Yes.
Like Chris was talking about the man with the duck head. Those are similar kind of mechanisms.
Yeah. Well, this is fun. Is there anything else that you'd like to say as we wrap things up here?
We could chat for a few minutes about the current work we're doing on nightmares and acute trauma.
Oh, yes, I meant to ask you about that.
Yeah, probably our nightmare chapter is one of the shortest in the entire book, but it's really a fascinating topic that both Greg and I share. And we've been we're really in the beginning stages, but in looking at patients who, following trauma, end up to the ER at Henry Ford here in downtown Detroit, and really assessing the effects of the trauma on their sleep, but also recording their dreams over the course of that month or so following exposure to trauma, to determine whether or not there are aspects of the dream or aspects of other things that might be disrupting their sleep that might predict the development of PTSD. And if we can sort of identify some of those things, the idea is if we can intervene early enough to prevent that sleep disturbance, to prevent maybe the fear of sleep that potentially occurs in conjunction with the nightmares that they oftentimes experience, can we prevent the onset of PTSD? And Greg was really instrumental in some of that, because as researchers, as we sort of mentioned earlier, it's oftentimes taboo to talk about the content of the dreams.
But, yeah, because everybody in the group, it's a larger group, and they were talking about nightmares and different scales rating nightmare frequency and severity and stuff. And I mentioned, why don't we ask people what their nightmare was about, the content, and everyone was kind of like, besides Chris, everyone else was kind of like puzzled. Well, like, I guess, I mean, I never thought of that. Yes, we could, but there's actually a lot of good evidence about that you can actually work directly with nightmares. There's a form of therapy called image rehearsal therapy, where you kind of try to redream the dream and reinhabit the dream and change its outcome, which is kind of it's kind of marketed as a cognitive behavioral strategy. It's just in my humble view, it's kind of a renaming of old Jungian techniques of dreaming the dream forward and trying to change it. It's just that same stuff in different language, more acceptable language.
And it might be worth, Greg, maybe you mentioning a little bit about in the context of reinterpreting a nightmare or reinterpreting a dream in a way, maybe you could discuss a little bit about the Hmong sort of experience. It's a very interesting story.
That is a fascinating story. After the Vietnam War, the Hmong were the mountain people in Vietnam and southern China that helped the U.S. during the Vietnam War. So when the South Vietnam fell, a lot of Hmong emigrated to this country.
Right.
And so they were finding some of the young Hmong males were dying at night, and they even had a name: sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome, SUNS. And they typically couldn't speak English, and the cardiologists in their Western way were kind of saying, well, maybe we should just put pacemakers into all Hmong males or something. When they actually talked to them, it seemed like what was happening is they were having nightmares, and the nightmares were so terrifying, and this feeling of helplessness and powerlessness, because they had the sleep paralysis that you get in dream sleep. But they interpreted that culturally as they weren't like performing the proper rituals in the proper way, because they were no longer home, and they were so afraid to sleep that they would keep themselves awake, and that was probably what caused the heart problems that killed them. But the interesting thing was there were some articles about that in the Los Angeles papers in the 60s, and Wes Craven, the filmmaker, read those articles, and that became the idea for the Nightmare on Elm Street series of movies. So they really emerged from that.
Wow. Well, you guys are full of wonderful kernels of history and creativity, and so if I think we're going to wrap it up here, unless there's something else.
No, thank you very much, and just wanted to say what an honor it's been to be on your show. I've listened to podcasts before, and it's not easy to impress my son, but when I was telling him that I was going to be on interviewed by Dr. Dave, he said, "Oh, I listen to Dr. Dave all the time. Apparently, he's very popular in the younger, psychologically minded crowd." So that's
Oh, wonderful. That's
Yeah,
great
we
to
really,
hear.
really appreciate the opportunity. I think it's, really one of the reasons why we wrote the book is to try to get some of these ideas across and
Yeah.
hopefully create society a little bit more and get the sort of dreaming back into
Yeah,
science.
I totally agree with you, and that's why I'm so happy to have had this opportunity to meet you two and to speak with you. And so, Doctors Greg Mahr and Chris Drake, thanks for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Dave.